Victoria Sterling was a woman who defined the city's skyline, but the city could never define her. She possessed everything the world craved: a tech empire that never slept, luxury hotels that touched the clouds, and a name that opened every door in the country. Yet, in the silent corridors of her glass and steel existence, there was a void that no amount of capital could fill. Victoria was a billionaire, but she was bankrupt in the one currency that mattered: a heart she could actually trust. For years, every man who knelt before her wasn't looking at her eyes. They were looking at the reflection of her bank balance in them. But soon, a quiet stranger would begin to appear in her world, a man who worked in the shadows of her bright lights, humble and unimpressed by the glitter. Just as fate began to weave their lives together, Victoria would make a choice that nearly cost her everything. She would send him away on the very night she would need him the most. The diamond-encrusted watch hit the mahogany desk with a dull, heavy thud. Victoria Sterling didn't blink. The silence that followed was suffocating, the kind of silence only found in offices built with too much power and too little soul. The watch lay there, its face cracked, looking like a small, expensive funeral for a promise that was never kept. Across the desk, a man in a tailored suit was trembling. Minutes ago, he had been leaning over her, whispering about their future merger, both corporate and marital. Now, a tablet lay between them, displaying a recording he never thought she'd see. "Just keep her happy until the contracts are signed." His voice rang out from the speakers, cold and calculating. "Once I am on the board, we'll pivot the assets and drain the sterling reserves. She's too lonely to notice until it's too late." Victoria slowly looked up. Her expression was a mask of cold marble. "Say something," the man stammered, his bravado leaking away. She tilted her head, her voice a low, dangerous silk. "So, the devotion was just a line item in a hostile takeover." "Victoria, I can explain, it was just talk." "No," she interrupted, one word, sharp, final. The man reached out, desperate. "Victoria, listen to me. It's a misunderstanding." Her hand lifted, a silent command that stopped him mid-breath. "Security," she said softly. The heavy doors swung open instantly. 2 guards stepped in. The man's face went pale. "Victoria, please, you know I care about you." She stared through him as if he were made of air. "You care about my father's legacy." As the guards dragged him out, his pleas echoed down the hall until the heavy doors clicked shut. Silence returned to the penthouse. Victoria stood still for a long moment, then a hollow, dry laugh escaped her lips. It wasn't the laugh of a victor. It was the laugh of a woman who had just confirmed her darkest fear. "Of course," she whispered to the empty room, "everyone wanted a piece of her. Her board wanted growth. Her rivals wanted her downfall. Her lovers wanted her treasury. Nobody ever wanted Victoria." A soft, rhythmic tapping sounded from the doorway. Victoria turned. Her father, the legendary founder of Sterling Global, stood there leaning on his silver-topped cane. Time and illness had thinned his frame, but his eyes remained as sharp as the day he made his first billion. He had heard it all. He limped slowly toward her. "I warned you, Victoria," he said, his voice raspy but steady. Victoria sighed, looking out at the city lights. "Yes, father, you did." He stopped beside her, looking out at the empire they had built together. "In the boardroom, people respect your strength," he said with the weight of 70 years of combat. "But in the bedroom, people smell opportunity." He placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip surprisingly firm. "Your mother was the only person who ever saw me without my crown. She died, and the world stayed hungry. You will inherit all of this soon: the jets, the towers, the thousands of lives under your thumb." He looked directly into her eyes, shaking his head slowly. "But love is a luxury people in our position simply cannot afford." The words sank into her like lead. Victoria looked down at her hands, powerful, wealthy, and entirely alone. For the first time in her life, she didn't argue. She simply turned back to her desk, closing her heart as tightly as a bank vault. She didn't know that downstairs, in the building's service entrance, a waiter named Marcus Reed was just beginning his shift, carrying a tray and a kind of dignity that her money could never buy. Subscribe to this channel to keep getting amazing stories. The morning after the diamond-encrusted watch, had been reduced to a pile of broken glass. Victoria Sterling stepped out of her black sedan with a posture that suggested she had never known a moment of weakness. The skyscraper housing Sterling Global loomed above her, a monument of glass and steel that she commanded. Yet as she walked through the lobby, her heels clicking against the polished marble like a countdown, she felt the familiar weight of the hollow her father had spoken of. Every employee she passed offered a bow or a hurried greeting, their eyes filled with a cocktail of fear and ambition. To them, she wasn't a woman, she was a ladder. By noon, the air in the boardroom had become stifling. Victoria sat at the head of the table, her face a mask of elegant boredom as a group of executives debated the acquisition of a luxury hotel chain. They spoke of optimizing human capital and synergistic growth, but all she heard was the rustle of paper and the clicking of expensive pens. Her mind drifted back to the broken watch, to the man who had called her baby, while calculating how to drain her reserves. The betrayal didn't hurt. It had simply turned into a cold stone in her chest, a reminder that her father's cynical philosophy was the only truth she could afford. "That will be all," she said, cutting off a vice president mid-sentence. The room cleared in seconds, leaving her alone with the city view that everyone envied. Seeking a moment of true silence, Victoria bypassed her usual five-star catering and slipped out of the building. She needed to be somewhere where the air didn't smell like desperation. 3 blocks away, tucked into a cobblestone side street that the modernization of the city had somehow missed, sat the Gilded Plate. It was an old-world restaurant, expensive enough to keep the riffraff out, but quiet enough to offer the anonymity she craved. She entered and was immediately met by the maitre d', who began to gush. "Ms. Sterling, what an unexpected honor. We have the corner booth, the one overlooking the garden, reserved just in case you." "I'll sit at the bar," Victoria interrupted, her voice a soft blade. "And I don't want to be disturbed." The staff scurried to comply, but as she took her seat, she could feel the shift in the room. The other patrons, men in silk ties and women draped in designer labels, began to whisper. They didn't look at her, they looked at the idea of her. She could practically hear them calculating the net worth of her earrings. She opened a leather-bound menu, using it as a shield, and felt the familiar wall of her guardedness rising. "Good afternoon. Would you like to start with something cold, or has it been a long morning?" The voice was calm. It didn't have the frantic, high-pitched edge of someone trying to impress a billionaire. Victoria looked up, expecting to see the usual fawning smile. Instead, she found herself looking into the steady, hazel eyes of a man who seemed entirely at peace with the world. He wore the crisp white shirt and black vest of a waiter, but he didn't wear the subservience that usually came with the uniform. This was Marcus Reed. "A long morning," Victoria replied, her voice instinctively guarded. "I'll have the sparkling water, no ice, lime." Marcus nodded, his movements fluid and efficient. He didn't linger. He didn't offer a compliment about her appearance or mention the latest headline featuring her company. He simply placed a linen napkin on the bar with a precision that spoke of quiet pride in his work. When he returned with the water, he didn't just set it down and vanish. He paused, noticing the way she was staring at her phone, her thumb hovering over a legal brief she was supposed to approve. "The garden is actually quite nice today," Marcus said softly, gesturing toward the window behind the bar. "The jasmine just bloomed. It's a better view than a screen." Victoria froze. People didn't give her advice. They gave her data. They gave her reports. But they didn't suggest she look at flowers. She looked up at him, her eyes narrowed. "Do you know who I am?" Marcus offered a small, genuine smile, one that reached his eyes but didn't demand anything in return. "You're the lady at the bar who looks like she's carrying the weight of the whole city on her shoulders. Is that who you are?" Victoria felt a strange, sharp prickle in her chest. For the first time in years, someone had answered her question without mentioning her last name or her net worth. He wasn't looking at her checkbook. He was looking at her exhaustion. "I am Victoria Sterling," she said, almost as a test, waiting for the inevitable change in his demeanor, the widening of the eyes, the sudden stiffness of the spine. "I'm Marcus," he replied simply, wiping a spot of water off the mahogany bar. And if you're as busy as they say you are, Victoria, you probably haven't eaten a real meal all day. The chef has a sea bass today that's light but honest. You look like you could use something honest. Victoria found herself speechless. Honest. The word hung in the air between them like a challenge. Every man she had ever known had offered her exquisite, exclusive, or expensive. No one had ever offered her honest. She watched him as he moved down the bar to serve another customer, a regular who tried to slip him a large bill to jump the line for a table. Victoria expected Marcus to take it with a wink. She was used to the world being for sale. But to her shock, Marcus gently pushed the bill back. "The wait is 15 minutes for everyone," said firmly but politely. "It wouldn't be fair to the couple who arrived before you." The man grumbled, but Marcus remained unmoved, his dignity intact. Victoria felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time: curiosity. She watched the way he handled the chaos of the lunch rush, never hurried, never flustered, treating the dishwasher who came out for a break with the same respect he gave the city's elite. When he returned to her, she didn't look at her phone. She looked at him. "I'll have the sea base," she said. "Good choice," he replied. As he walked away, Victoria realized her heart rate had slowed for the first time since the watch had shattered. There was no smell of opportunity around Marcus Reed. There was only the scent of jasmine from the garden and the steady, quiet hum of a man who knew exactly who he was, regardless of who was sitting in front of him. She took a sip of her water, her eyes following him through the crowded room. He was a waiter, a man who lived a life she couldn't imagine, a life of shifts and tips and humble apartments. To the world she lived in, he was invisible. But as Marcus looked back at her and gave a small, respectful nod before disappearing into the kitchen, Victoria realized with a start that he was the only person in the room who had actually seen her. The wall around her heart didn't fall, but for the first time, a single brick had been loosened. She didn't know his story, and he clearly didn't care about hers, and in the high-priced, transactional world of Victoria Sterling, that made him the most interesting man she had ever met. She turned her phone face down on the bar, and for the first time in a decade, she looked at the flowers. The following weeks were a blur of high-stakes negotiations and cold, lonely victories that left Victoria feeling more like a machine than a woman. The encounter with Marcus at the restaurant remained tucked in the back of her mind, a quiet memory of honesty that she treated like a secret treasure. But the pressure of the Sterling Empire was relentless. Seeking to escape the prying eyes of the board and the suffocating luxury of her city penthouse, Victoria decided to retreat to the Obsidian. Her private estate nestled deep in the coastal cliffs, 3 hours from the city's roar. The Obsidian was a masterpiece of glass and black basalt, a ghost house where she had spent millions to ensure she would never have to see another human soul. It was a fully automated sanctuary, governed by an advanced AI system that controlled everything from the climate to the biometric locks. Here, Victoria didn't need a staff. She didn't need a chef. She only needed the silence. The storm began as a low growl over the ocean just as she arrived. By the time she stepped through the massive pivoting front door, the sky had turned the color of a bruise. The house hummed to life as she entered, the floor lights illuminating her path with a ghostly blue glow. "Welcome home, Victoria," a smooth, synthetic voice echoed through the hallway. "The temperature has been set to 68 degrees. Would you like the evening news?" "Silence, Aura," Victoria murmured, dropping her bag on the designer sofa. "And lock the perimeter. I don't want to be reached." "Perimeter sealed," the AI responded. Victoria stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the rain lash against the reinforced glass. For the first time in months, she felt she could breathe. She went to the kitchen, intending to pour a glass of wine, but stopped when she saw a crate of gourmet supplies sitting on the island. It was the delivery she had ordered for her stay. Beside it stood a man in a rain-slicked utility jacket, checking a digital clipboard. Victoria's heart jolted. She had forgotten that the automated delivery protocols allowed for a 5-minute window for manual stocking. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice sharp with the reflex of a woman used to threats. The man turned around and the breath caught in Victoria's throat. It was Marcus. He looked different without the waiter's vest, more rugged, his hair damp from the spray of the sea, but his eyes were the same. They were steady, unimpressed by the architectural marvel around them. "Marcus," she breathed, her guard momentarily slipping. "Victoria," he said, showing no sign of shock. "I didn't realize this was your place. I pick up extra shifts for the high-end logistics firm that services this area. The restaurant doesn't always cover the rent." Before she could respond, a deafening crack of thunder shook the foundation of the house. Simultaneously, every light in the estate flickered and died. The hum of the climate control vanished, replaced by an eerie, heavy silence. "Aura," Victoria called out, no response. A moment later, the emergency red lights pulsed dimly. A metallic grinding sound echoed from the walls. "Warning," the AI's voice crackled, sounding distorted and frantic. "System breach detected due to lightning strike. Safety Protocol 909 initiated. Total lockdown in effect to protect high-value assets. Biometric sensors offline." Victoria ran to the front door and pulled the handle. It wouldn't budge. She moved to the windows, but the heavy steel shutters, designed to protect the glass from hurricane-force winds, were already sliding down, sealing them into total darkness. "Aura abort lockdown. Override code 4-4-9 Alpha," Victoria shouted. Override failed, the machine whispered before the speakers emitted a final, dying pop. Silence returned, thicker than before. The obsidian, her sanctuary of glass and light, had transformed into a black box of steel and stone. They were trapped. "Well," Marcus' voice came through the dark, remarkably calm. "I suppose that sea bass was a better memory than this is going to be." Victoria felt a wave of panic, a sensation she usually suppressed with logic. The walls are reinforced basalt. The shutters are grade 5 steel. There are no manual releases from the inside. It's a security feature to prevent kidnappings. No one can get in. "And no one can get out," Marcus added. He clicked on a small industrial flashlight from his belt, the beam cutting through the gloom. He didn't look at the locked doors with fear. He looked at Victoria. "How long till your security team notices the signal is dead?" "They won't," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I told them I was going off the grid. I disabled the heartbeat monitor so I could have peace. They won't check on me for 48 hours. She sank onto the kitchen stool, the weight of her own wealth finally crushing her. She had built a fortress so perfect that it had become her tomb. She looked at her hands in the dim red light, the hands of a billionaire who could buy companies with a signature, yet couldn't open a single door. Marcus walked over, but he didn't crowd her. He set his flashlight on the counter, aiming it at the ceiling so the light reflected softly throughout the room. He reached into the delivery crate and pulled out a simple loaf of bread and a jar of preserves. "Panic burns through oxygen," he said quietly. "And we might be here a while. You have 2 choices, Victoria. You can spend the next 2 days staring at those steel shutters, or you can sit down and talk to a guy who doesn't want a single thing from you." Victoria looked at him, the man she had cast as an invisible servant in her mind. He was the only thing in this house that wasn't a machine, the only thing that wasn't programmed to serve her ego or protect her assets. "I don't even know how to be a person without a schedule," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. Marcus broke off a piece of the bread and offered it to her. "It's easy. You start by admitting that all this," he gestured to the cold, dark walls of the mansion, "is just a fancy cage. And then you tell me what you wanted to be before you became a sterling." The storm raged outside, battering the steel skin of the house, but inside the ghost house, the silence began to change. As Victoria took the bread from his hand, she felt the cold stone in her chest begin to thaw. The billionaire was gone. There was only a woman in the dark, rediscovering what it felt like to be seen. In her most expensive prison, she had finally found the only thing she couldn't buy, a moment of true, unscripted human connection. The hours inside the lightless shell of the obsidian bled together, the passage of time marked only by the rhythmic drumming of the storm against the steel shutters. Inside, the air grew cool and still, but the tension that usually radiated from Victoria had begun to dissipate, replaced by a strange, quiet lucidity. She sat on the kitchen island, her legs pulled to her chest, watching the amber glow of the industrial flashlight as Marcus moved through the darkened kitchen. He didn't move like the chefs she employed, men who barked orders and treated ingredients like surgical components. Marcus moved with a gentle, intuitive grace. He had found a small portable gas range in the emergency pantry and was now coaxing a flame into existence. The blue light flickered against his face, highlighting the calm strength in his features. "You know," Victoria said, her voice sounding small in the vast, echoing room, "I have a personal chef who studied under 3 different Michelin-starred masters. My kitchen is usually filled with the scent of truffle oil and saffron, but right now, it'd give half my board seats for a grilled cheese sandwich." Marcus chuckled, a warm sound that seemed to push back the shadows. "Luxury has a way of complicating things that are meant to be simple. Food isn't about status, Victoria. It's about fuel and memory. People like your chef cook for your ego. I'm just cooking because you're hungry." He began to slice the crusty bread he had brought in the delivery, the sound of the knife against the wooden board sharp and rhythmic. From the crate, he produced a few humble items: vine-ripened tomatoes, a block of sharp cheddar, some fresh basil leaves that had survived the journey, and a small tin of high-quality butter. "The secret to truth," Marcus said, glancing up at her as he laid the slices in a heavy cast-iron pan, "is not hiding the ingredients. In your world, everything is covered in heavy sauces, metaphorically speaking. You hide the person behind the title, the motive behind the smile. But bread, butter, and salt, they can't lie to you." As the butter began to sizzle, a scent began to fill the kitchen that Victoria hadn't encountered in years. It wasn't the complex, intimidating aroma of a gala dinner. It was the smell of home, or at least, the home she had imagined as a child before her father's empire had consumed their lives. It was warm, toasted, and rich. Victoria watched his hands. They were calloused, the hands of a man who worked, yet they handled the basil leaves with incredible tenderness. "Why are you still a waiter, Marcus? Or a delivery driver? You're clearly more intelligent than half the analysts I pay 6 figures. Marcus flipped the sandwiches, the golden brown crust appearing perfectly even in the flashlight's beam. "I like being the one who sees people when they think no one is looking," he said quietly. "In a restaurant, people drop their masks for a second when the food arrives. They show their real selves. Besides, I like my freedom. I don't own much, but I own my time. Can you say the same?" Victoria opened her mouth to argue, to list her achievements and her influence, but the words died in her throat. She looked at the dead AI consoles and the locked steel doors. She was the most powerful woman in the city, and she was currently dependent on a man she had considered invisible to keep her warm and fed. "No," she admitted, "I can't." Marcus plated the sandwiches and slid one toward her. He didn't use a fine china plate. He used a simple ceramic one from the back of the cupboard. He also poured 2 glasses of water, placing one beside her. "Eat," he commanded gently. "No phones, no stock tickers, no 5-year plans, just the taste of the truth." Victoria took a bite. The bread was perfectly crisp, yielding to a center of melted, sharp cheese and the bright, acidic burst of the tomatoes. The basil added a peppery finish that tied it all together. It was simple, even primitive compared to her usual fare, but as the flavors hit her tongue, Victoria felt a sudden, stinging heat behind her eyes. It tasted like the Saturday afternoons shed spent with her mother before the illness took her. It tasted like safety. It tasted like a life where she didn't have to be the billionaire. She started, her voice thick. She took another bite, unable to find the right corporate-approved adjective. "It's the best thing I've ever had." "That's because it's the first thing you've eaten in a long time that didn't come with an agenda," Marcus said. He sat on a stool opposite her, eating his own meal with the same quiet dignity he showed at the restaurant. For the next hour, the ghost house was no longer a prison. They sat in the small circle of light, and Victoria found herself talking. She didn't talk about mergers or market shares. She talked about the books she used to read under the covers, her fear of failing her father's legacy, and the crushing weight of being a trophy that everyone wanted to put in their cabinet. Marcus listened. He didn't interrupt with advice or try to find a solution to her problems. He simply bore witness to her words, his presence a steady anchor in the dark. "You're the first person to actually listen to me," Victoria whispered, looking at him over the rim of her glass. "Usually, people are just waiting for me to finish so they can ask for a favor." "Maybe you've been talking to the wrong people," Marcus replied. He reached out, his hand hovering near hers on the counter. He didn't grab it, he simply left it there and offered connection. "Wealth is a loud noise, Victoria. It's hard to hear the truth over the sound of money, but here, in the dark, the noise is gone." Victoria slowly reached out and rested her hand over his. His skin was warm, a stark contrast to the cold basalt of the kitchen island. For a moment, the power dynamics of the world outside were inverted. The man with nothing was giving everything to the woman who had it all. As the storm began to subside, leaving only a soft patter against the shutters, Victoria realized that the smart house had done her a favor by breaking. It had stripped away the billionaire and left the woman. And as she looked at Marcus Reed in the dying glow of the flashlight, she realized that the taste of truth was something she never wanted to lose again. The simple meal had done what $1 billion couldn't. It had made her feel found. The transition from the lightless sanctuary of the obsidian back to the glass and chrome reality of the city felt like a plunge into freezing water. When the backup systems finally groaned to life and the steel shutters retreated, Victoria stepped back into her life as a billionaire. But she did not return alone. She had driven Marcus back to the city herself, the silence between them in the car no longer awkward, but heavy with the weight of things left unsaid. When she walked into the lobby of Sterling Global the next morning, her stride was as commanding as ever, yet there was a softness in her eyes, a lingering warmth from the taste of truth that she couldn't quite hide. It was a change that did not go unnoticed. In the high-altitude offices of the executive floor, where ambition was the only air anyone breathed, small shifts in power were felt like seismic tremors. Arthur Vane, the chief operating officer and a man who had spent a decade positioning himself as Victoria's most loyal shadow, watched her from his glass-walled office. Arthur was a man of sharp angles and expensive tailoring, a predator who thrived on the transactional nature of their world. For years, he had waited for Victoria's emotional walls to crumble, intending to be the one to pick up the pieces and, by extension, the keys to the Sterling kingdom. He saw her pause at her desk, not to check the morning's global markets, but to look at a small, dried basil leaf she had tucked into her notebook, a memento from a kitchen island in a storm. He saw the way she dismissed her usual morning briefing with a distracted wave of her hand. Most tellingly, he saw her smile at a text message, a genuine expression that didn't involve a calculated business victory. Arthur didn't need a private investigator to tell him that something had changed. He only needed to follow the trail of her recent movements. By noon, he had accessed the logistics logs from the Obsidian. He saw the name, Marcus Reed, a waiter, a delivery driver, a ghost. "A waiter," Arthur whispered to himself, his lips curling in a sneer that didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. To Arthur, Marcus wasn't a man. He was an anomaly, a glitch in the system that needed to be erased. He didn't fear Marcus' wealth, for there was none, but he feared Marcus' influence. If Victoria stopped believing that love was a luxury she couldn't afford, she would stop relying on men like Arthur to guard her heart and her assets. The smear campaign began not with a bang, but with a series of carefully placed whispers. Arthur knew that to destroy a woman like Victoria, you didn't attack her directly, you poisoned the environment around her. He started with the board of directors. "I'm concerned about Victoria's focus," Arthur remarked during a private lunch with the lead investors. He swirled a vintage red wine, looking the picture of a worried confidant. "She's been spending a significant amount of time with questionable elements, security risks, a man with no background, no standing, suddenly having private access to her most secluded estates. In our position, we have to wonder if it's a security breach or a lapse in judgment." The seeds of doubt were sown. By the next day, the whispers had traveled from the boardroom to the break rooms. Arthur used his connections with the city's tabloid editors to leak a grainy photo taken from a distance. Victoria and Marcus sitting in the front of her car, their silhouettes close together. The headline was designed to sting. The sterling heiress and the scavenger. Is the empire at risk? Victoria first felt the change in the air during the afternoon strategy meeting. The room, usually filled with sycophants eager for her approval, was suddenly thick with a judgmental chill. She saw her executives trading glances over their tablets. She saw the way they looked at her, not with the usual fear, but with a new, mocking curiosity. "Is there an issue with the third-quarter projections?" Victoria asked, her voice cracking like a whip across the table. "No, Victoria," one of the senior partners said, his voice dripping with forced concern. "We're just wondering if your personal distractions might affect the upcoming merger with the Holloway Group. They are a traditional family. They value stability. This news about you and the service worker, it creates an image of vulnerability." Victoria felt a flush of anger rise in her throat. "My personal life is not a line item on your balance sheet." "When your personal life threatens the stock price, it becomes our business," Arthur Vane said smoothly, stepping into the room. He walked to the head of the table, placing a hand on the back of Victoria's chair in a gesture that looked supportive but felt like a claim of ownership. "We all want what's best for you, Victoria, but you have to admit the optics are disastrous. People are saying he's a con artist. They're saying he targeted you at the restaurant. A man like that doesn't just happen to be trapped in a house with a billionaire by accident." "He didn't know it was my house," Victoria snapped, though a tiny, cold seed of her father's cynicism tried to take root in her mind. "Of course he didn't," Arthur cooed, his voice laced with poison. "And I am sure it's just a coincidence that he's been seen at 3 of your different properties in the last month. He's playing the long game, Victoria. He's invisible, so he can move through your life unnoticed until he finds the vault." Victoria looked around the room. She saw 20 faces, all of them reflecting the same suspicion. This was the world she had built, a world where kindness was a red flag and honesty was a lie that hadn't been caught yet. The shadow of the corporation was closing in, trying to dim the light that Marcus had ignited. As she left the boardroom, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Marcus. "The jasmine in the park is even better than the restaurant garden. If you need to breathe, I'm here." She looked at the screen, then at Arthur, who was watching her from the end of the hallway with a triumphant, predatory smile. For the first time, Victoria felt the two halves of her world colliding. Arthur represented everything she knew: power, protection, and the safety of a cold heart. Marcus represented everything she feared: vulnerability, the unknown, and a truth that didn't need a contract. "Arthur," she called out, her voice regaining its billionaire edge. "Yes, Victoria." "Tell the PR team to draft a statement. I want it made clear that my associations are my own." Arthur's smile didn't falter. "I'll handle it, Victoria. I'll handle everything." As he turned away, Arthur pulled his own phone from his pocket. He didn't call the PR team. He called a private security firm known for their discreet removals. The smear campaign had been the warning. If Marcus Reed didn't take the hint and vanish back into the shadows, Arthur was prepared to make sure he disappeared for good. The corporate shadow was no longer just a whisper. It was a noose, and it was beginning to tighten around the only honest thing Victoria Sterling had ever found. The following days were a study in orchestrated tension. Victoria moved through her empire like a ghost in a machine, her mind constantly drifting back to the quiet strength of Marcus, even as Arthur Vane's poisoned whispers began to manifest in her daily life. She felt the eyes of her security detail lingering on her too long, and she noticed the subtle way her father's old associates began to question her mental clarity during high-stakes calls. The corporate shadow was no longer just a concept. It was a physical weight, pressing against her chest every time she thought of the man who had cooked her a simple meal in a storm. Seeking to silence the noise and reclaim her sense of reality, Victoria invited Marcus to her private study at the Sterling Ancestral Wing, a place where history was kept in glass cases and the air smelled of old leather and legacy. She wanted to show him that she trusted him, that the world Arthur described was not the one she chose to live in. "This belonged to my great-grandmother," Victoria said, her voice echoing softly as they stood before a velvet-lined display case. Inside sat the Eye of the Empress, a sapphire brooch of such intense blue it seemed to hold a flicker of its own light. It was more than a jewel. It was the symbol of the sterling ascent, a priceless artifact that represented the very heart of her family's history. Marcus stood beside her, his hands tucked respectfully into the pockets of his modest jacket. He didn't look at the gem with greed or even awe. He looked at it the way a gardener might look at a rare flower, appreciating its beauty but recognizing its fragility. "It's beautiful," he said quietly, "but it looks heavy. Everything in this room looks like it would be a burden to carry." Victoria looked at him, surprised by the insight. "It is. It's a reminder that I am just a temporary guardian of things that will outlive me." They spent an hour in that quiet room, talking about things that had nothing to do with value or price. For a moment, the world of smear campaigns and boardroom coups felt like a distant nightmare. But as Marcus prepared to leave to catch his late shift at the restaurant, the atmosphere shifted. Arthur Vane appeared in the doorway, his silhouette sharp and predatory. Behind him stood two head of security, their faces set in grim masks. Victoria's heart sank. She knew this look. It was the look of a trap being sprung. "Victoria," Arthur said, his voice dripping with a fake, mournful concern. "I am so sorry to interrupt, but we've had a breach." "What are you talking about, Arthur?" Victoria stepped forward, her billionaire persona snapping back into place. "I am with a guest." "That's exactly the problem," Arthur replied, gesturing to the security team. "As you know, the Eye of the Empress has a weight-sensitive alarm. It was triggered 30 seconds ago. The sensors indicate the case was opened and the artifact was replaced with a high-quality glass replica." Victoria spun around. The brooch looked exactly the same through the glass, but as she leaned closer, she saw the subtle lack of depth in the stone. Her blood ran cold. "Check the cameras." The cameras in this wing were undergoing a scheduled maintenance update 10 minutes ago, Arthur said smoothly, his eyes never leaving Marcus. "A tragic coincidence. However, the exit sensors are still active, and they've flagged a high-density metallic signature on our guest." Marcus didn't move. He didn't panic. He simply stood there, looking at Victoria with a steady, heartbreaking clarity. "I didn't touch it, Victoria." "Of course you didn't," she whispered, her voice trembling. But the logic that had been drilled into her since birth, the logic of her father, the logic of a woman who had been betrayed 1,000 times, began to scream. "Search," commanded. "No," Victoria shouted, but it was too late. One of the guards stepped forward and reached into the side pocket of Marcus' jacket. When the guard pulled his hand out, the Eye of the Empress was clutched in his fingers, its sapphire depths mocking the silence of the room. It was unmistakable. It was impossible. "A classic play," Arthur said, his voice a low, satisfied hum. "The humble waiter, the honest man finding his way into the inner sanctum. I told you, Victoria. In love, people smell opportunity. He was never looking at you. He was looking at the vault." Victoria felt the floor beneath her tilt. She looked at Marcus, searching for a sign of guilt, a flicker of the scavenger Arthur had described. But Marcus only looked at her with a profound, quiet sadness. He didn't look at Arthur. He didn't look at the guards. He looked at the woman he had shared bread with in the dark. "Is that what you believe?" Marcus asked, his voice barely a whisper. Victoria looked at the brooch in the guard's hand, then at the man she had allowed herself to trust. The weight of her empire, the warnings of her father, and the cold evidence before her eyes converged into a single, devastating moment of doubt. This was the world she knew, a world where everyone wanted something. Victoria's voice broke. She couldn't say it, but she didn't stop them when the guards stepped forward to take him by the arms. "I didn't take it, Victoria," Marcus said again, his voice steady even as they began to lead him away. "But the fact that you have to wonder, that's the real theft here. He didn't just steal a stone. He stole the person you were becoming." "Get him out of my sight," Victoria commanded, her voice turning into a shard of ice. She couldn't look at him anymore. She couldn't look at the truth or the lie. She only wanted the silence back. Arthur stepped closer, his hand resting on her shoulder in a gesture of triumph disguised as comfort. "You did the right thing, Victoria. You protected the legacy. He was a shadow, nothing more. Forget him. But as the heavy doors closed and Marcus was dragged out of the ancestral wing, Victoria didn't feel protected. She felt hollow. She looked at the sapphire brooch, sitting once again in its velvet cage, and realized that for all its beauty, it was the coldest thing in the room. She had saved the heirloom, but as she stood alone in the dark of her family's history, she realized she might have just lost the only thing that was ever actually hers. The trap had worked. The invisible man was gone, and the billionaire was back on her throne, exactly where the corporate shadow wanted her to be. The aftermath of the theft was a silent, suffocating ice age. Victoria didn't just banish Marcus from her sight. She erased him from her world with the cold efficiency of a corporate liquidation. She had him blacklisted from the restaurant, terminated from the logistics firm, and issued a legal warning that felt like a death sentence to a man of his standing. She did it all from behind her mahogany desk, her eyes fixed on spreadsheets that blurred into meaningless grids of gray. She told herself she was being strong, that she was finally the daughter her father had raised her to be. But every time she closed her eyes, she didn't see the stolen sapphire. She saw Marcus' face as he walked away, not with anger, but with a pity that burned deeper than any insult. A week later, the sky over the city mirrored her internal landscape, dark, heavy, and ready to break. Victoria had stayed late at the office, burying herself in a merger that required her to be more machine than human. She dismissed her driver, wanting, for the first time in her life, to drive herself. She needed to feel in control of something, even if it was just a steering wheel. As she pulled out of the Sterling Global garage in her custom-built, $500,000 Grand Tourer, the rain began. It wasn't a gentle shower. It was a deluge that turned the city's neon lights into smeared, bleeding streaks of color. The world outside her leather-scented cabin felt hostile, but Victoria pressed on, her jaw set. 6 blocks from the safety of her penthouse, the luxury she had relied upon her entire life betrayed her. A jagged piece of metal, hidden in a deep puddle in a construction zone, tore through her reinforced tire. The car lurched, the sophisticated suspension screaming as the rim ground against the asphalt. Then, with a pathetic electronic whimper, the entire dashboard went dark. A freak electrical surge, perhaps triggered by the storm and the impact, had fried the car's high-tech brain. The doors, controlled by electronic actuators, remained locked. Victoria felt a surge of claustrophobia. She pressed the emergency release, a manual lever hidden beneath the seat, and stumbled out into the freezing rain. The street was a narrow, one-way vein in the city's older district, a place where the towering skyscrapers blocked out the sky and the streetlights flickered with a dying orange pulse. She reached for her phone, but as the screen lit up, she saw the no-service icon. The canyon of steel and stone around her had created a dead zone. "Aura, call security," she whispered out of habit, but there was no AI in the rain. There was only the sound of water rushing into the gutters and the distant, rhythmic thumping of music from a basement club. Victoria began to walk, her designer heels splashing through oily puddles. She looked like a fallen queen, her silk blouse clinging to her skin, her hair plastered to her face. She felt a sudden, sharp prickle of fear. This was the cold rain of reality Marcus had lived in every day, a world where things didn't just work because you were a sterling. As she turned a corner into a shadowed alleyway that promised a shortcut to a main artery, she realized her mistake. 3 figures emerged from the gloom, their silhouettes jagged and predatory. They didn't see a billionaire, they saw a target. They saw the diamond earrings that cost more than their lives and the watch that had replaced the one shed broken. "Lost, lady?" one of them asked, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. He stepped into the flickering light of a broken neon sign. He was young, his eyes hollowed out by a hunger that no board meeting could ever understand. "I am calling the police," Victoria said, her voice trembling despite her attempt at a command. She reached for her phone, but the second man lunged, knocking it from her hand. It skittered across the wet pavement and vanished into a storm drain. "Don't think you're calling anyone," the third man said, stepping closer. He pulled a small, rusted knife from his pocket. The blade didn't gleam like her family's silver. It looked dull and thirsty. Victoria backed away, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She hit a brick wall, cold, rough, and indifferent to her status. For the first time in her life, her name meant nothing. Her bank account was a series of zeros that couldn't protect her. She was alone in the dark, and the men were closing in. "The jewelry," the leader demanded, reaching out to grab her arm. "Take it off, or I'll take it off for you." Victoria closed her eyes, a sob rising in her throat. She thought of her father's words, that love was a luxury they couldn't afford. But in this moment, she realized the truth was far worse. In her world, they had traded human connection for a wall of gold, and now that the wall had crumbled, there was no one left to hear her scream. She waited for the impact, for the cold bite of the steel. But instead, she heard a sound that didn't belong in this nightmare, the high-pitched, straining whine of a small engine. A beat-up delivery scooter skidded around the corner, its headlight cutting through the rain like a desperate searchlight. The rider didn't hesitate. He drove the scooter directly between Victoria and the three men, the tires splashing a wall of dirty water over the attackers. The rider jumped off before the bike even stopped. He stood tall, his posture not one of a fighter, but of a man who had nothing left to lose and therefore feared nothing. He didn't have a weapon. He didn't have a security team. He only had a quiet, ironclad dignity. "Get back," the rider said. The voice was calm. It was steady. It was the voice that had told her the jasmine was blooming. It was Marcus. The three men hesitated. They looked at the newcomer, a man who looked like he belonged to the streets as much as they did, but who carried himself like a king. Marcus didn't look at Victoria. He kept his eyes on the leader, his hands open at his sides. "She's got nothing you want," Marcus said, his voice cutting through the rain. "The jewelry is tracked. The watch has a GPS pulse. You touch her, and you're lit up on every police scanner in the city within 5 minutes. Is a few years in a cage worth a piece of blue glass?" The leader looked at Marcus, then at Victoria, who was shaking so hard she could barely stand. He looked at the scooter, then back at the knife. With a frustrated curse, he spat on the ground and gestured for the others to follow him. They retreated into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as they had appeared. Silence returned to the alley, save for the sound of the rain and Marcus' heavy breathing. He stood there for a long moment, his back to her, before he finally turned around. He looked exhausted. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his black vest was torn at the shoulder. He had lost his job, his reputation, and his peace because of her. And yet, here he was, standing in the cold rain of the reality she had cast him into. "Are you hurt?" he asked. There was no bitterness in his voice. No, "I told you so." Only the same honest concern that had broken her heart in the kitchen of the ghost house. Victoria tried to speak, but she could only let out a broken, jagged breath. She took a step toward him, her legs giving way. Marcus caught her before she hit the ground, his arms strong and warm against her soaked skin. "I am sorry," she whispered into his chest, the words finally breaking through the ice. "Marcus, I'm so sorry." "I know," he said softly, pulling her closer as the rain continued to fall. "I know, let's get you home." But as he helped her toward his small, battered scooter, Victoria realized she didn't want to go back to the penthouse. She didn't want to go back to the glass towers and the lying shadows. For the first time, the billionaire woman realized that home wasn't a place you could buy. It was the person who stayed when the world turned dark. The ride on the back of the small, sputtering scooter felt more intimate than any flight in her private jet ever had. Victoria clung to Marcus, her face pressed against the rough fabric of his damp jacket, as they navigated the labyrinth of the city's lower districts. The neon lights of her world faded into the dim, warm glow of street lamps and small corner bodegas. When they finally stopped, it wasn't at a gated manor, but at a weathered brick building with a flickering light in the hallway and a door that required a physical key, not a biometric scan. Marcus' apartment was a single room that would have fit inside Victoria's walk-in closet, yet as the door clicked shut behind them, she felt a sense of peace that her mansion had never provided. The air smelled faintly of cedar and the remains of a simple tea. There was a single bed, a small desk covered in books, and a window that didn't look out over the skyline, but into a courtyard where a neighbor was playing a soft, acoustic guitar. "It's not much," Marcus said, handing her a clean, oversized cotton shirt and a worn pair of sweatpants. "But it's dry. The bathroom is through that door. Get out of those wet clothes before you catch pneumonia." Victoria emerged from the small bathroom minutes later, the hem of his shirt reaching her mid-thigh. She felt small, stripped of her armor, and incredibly vulnerable. She watched as Marcus moved through the tiny space, lighting a small stove to boil water. There were no Aura AI assistants here, no hidden speakers, no cold basalt floors. Everything was within reach, and everything was there because it served a purpose. On his desk, she saw a framed photograph. It wasn't of a celebrity or a business mogul. It was an older woman with the same kind eyes as Marcus, standing in a small garden. Beside it was a stack of books on philosophy and architecture, subjects Victoria had studied for prestige, but Marcus seemed to study for his soul. "My mother," Marcus said, noticing her gaze as he handed her a steaming mug of tea. "She taught me that the only things you truly own are the things you can carry in your heart when the lights go out." Victoria sat on the edge of the bed, the warmth of the mug seeping into her palms. "I destroyed your life, Marcus. I took your jobs. I let them call you a thief. Why did you come for me?" Marcus sat in the lone wooden chair across from her, his expression unreadable in the soft amber light of a desk lamp. "Because I knew you weren't the one who put that brooch in my pocket. I knew the woman who ate that sandwich in the dark. That woman didn't want to hurt me. She was just scared that if she didn't act like a billionaire, she wouldn't exist at all." He leaned forward, the shadows catching the tired lines around his eyes. "I didn't come for the CEO of Sterling Global, Victoria. I came for the girl who likes the smell of jasmine." Victoria looked down at her tea, a tear escaping and splashing into the dark liquid. "Everyone in my world told me you were a scavenger. They said you were waiting for a chance to rob me." "I did rob," said softly, causing her to look up in surprise. He offered a small, sad smile. "I robbed you of the lie that money is a shield, and I think that's why your friend Arthur hates me so much. You can't control someone who has already found the one thing they need." As the night deepened, Victoria saw the reality of his sacrifice. She saw the final notice bill on his table that she had caused. She saw the way he winced when he moved, a reminder of the scuffle in the alley. For the first time, the invisible man was the only thing she could see clearly. He lived in a one-room sanctuary, but he was freer than she had ever been in her glass tower. "I'm going to fix this," Victoria whispered, her voice regaining a different kind of strength, one born of conviction rather than command. "Not as a billionaire, as myself." Marcus reached out, his hand covering hers. "The only way to fix it, Victoria, is to stop looking at people as assets and start looking at them as stories. My story isn't over yet. Neither is yours." That night, Victoria Sterling didn't sleep on a $3,000 mattress. She slept on a narrow bed in a room that smelled of cedar and honesty, while the man who had lost everything to save her watched over her from the chair. As she drifted off, she realized that the luxury her father said she couldn't afford wasn't love. It was the truth. And she had finally found it in the one place she never thought to look. The sun rose over the city not with a burst of glory, but with the cold, gray clarity of a winter dawn. Victoria stood by Marcus' small window, watching the early light touch the tops of the tenements. She was still wearing his oversized shirt, but her eyes had regained the sharp, calculating fire that had built her empire. This time, however, that fire wasn't fueled by the desire for profit, but by a hunger for justice. Marcus was still asleep, his face peaceful in the shadows, a stark contrast to the wreckage she had caused in his life. She knew that to save him, she had to return to the world of shadows she had tried to flee. By 8 o'clock, Victoria was standing in the high-security server room of Sterling Global. She hadn't called ahead. She hadn't notified Arthur Vane. She had entered through the service basement, using a physical override key her father had given her years ago, one that bypassed the digital logs Arthur now monitored. The room was a labyrinth of humming black towers and blinking blue lights, the digital brain of her kingdom. To the world, this was just data, but to Victoria, it was a graveyard of secrets. She sat at a terminal, her fingers flying across the keys with a precision that blurred the line between woman and machine. "Aura," she whispered, her voice low. "Access the eye of the Empress security sublayer, not the visual feed, the metadata." "Accessing," the synthetic voice replied, sounding hollow in the cold air. "Encryption level, Alpha, authorized by Victoria Sterling." Victoria didn't look at the footage of the night of the theft. She knew it had been wiped or looped. Instead, she looked for the ghosts. She looked for the millisecond gaps in the heartbeat of the house, the tiny, invisible pauses where a master user would have to suspend the system to bypass weight sensors. She searched for the digital fingerprint of the person who had initiated the scheduled maintenance that had blinded the cameras. The trail was buried under layers of dummy accounts and offshore routing, but Victoria had designed the core architecture of this system herself. She knew that every lie left a shadow. She found a single, unauthorized login from a mobile device at 7:42 p.m. on the night of the frame-up. The location was precise, the hallway just outside her ancestral wing. "Trace the device ID," Victoria commanded. Tracing, device ID linked to a secure encrypted handset. Owner, Arthur Vane. The confirmation hit her like a physical blow, even though she had expected it. But she needed more than a login. She needed the motive. She pushed deeper, bypassing Arthur's private firewalls, diving into the deleted folders of his encrypted communications. She found a thread of messages with a private security firm, the same one that had discreetly handled Marcus. "The mark is in place, one message read. Plant the stone in the left jacket pocket during the distraction. Ensure the billionaire sees the search. If she wavers, push the security risk narrative. Once the waiter is gone, we proceed with the board takeover." Victoria felt a cold shiver of realization. Arthur hadn't just wanted Marcus gone. He wanted her isolated, broken, and dependent on him so he could stage a silent coup within the company. He had used her trauma and her father's cynicism as weapons against her. She downloaded everything: the logs, the messages, the biometric signatures of the guards who had been paid to plant the brooch. As the progress bar reached 100%, the heavy steel door of the server room slid open. Arthur Vane stood there, his silhouette framed by the harsh fluorescent lights of the corridor. He looked immaculate, his tie perfectly knotted, but his eyes were wide with a flickering, panicked rage. "Victoria," he said, his voice a strained attempt at his usual smooth baritone. "What are you doing down here? Security flagged an unauthorized entry. I was worried." Victoria didn't move from the terminal. She turned the screen toward him, the scrolling lines of his betrayal reflecting in her calm, dark eyes. "I was just looking for the snake in the grass, Arthur. It turns out he was sitting in the office next to mine for 10 years. Arthur's face went pale, then curdled into a sneer of pure, unfiltered venom. He didn't try to deny it. "You were weak, Victoria. You were letting a common laborer cloud your judgment. I did what was necessary for the company, for the Sterling name. You were going to throw everything away for a man who serves soup for a living." "He didn't serve soup, Arthur," Victoria said, standing up. She walked toward him, her presence filling the room with the weight of her rediscovered power. "He served the truth, something you wouldn't recognize if it hit you." "You have no proof that will hold up in court," Arthur hissed, stepping closer. "I've buried those logs under a dozen shells." "I don't need a court, Arthur," Victoria said, a small, dangerous smile touching her lips. "I own the servers. I own the press. And as of 5 minutes ago, I've shared these files with the entire board of directors and the district attorney. You didn't just fail to frame a waiter. You failed to realize that I am the one who built the cage you're standing in." The sound of heavy boots echoed in the hallway. The very security Team Arthur had used to drag Marcus away now appeared behind him, but they weren't looking at Victoria. They were looking at Arthur. "Arthur Vane," the lead officer said, "you're under investigation for grand larceny, conspiracy, and corporate espionage. Step away from the CEO." As they led Arthur away, he didn't scream or plead. He simply looked at Victoria with a cold, dead stare. But she didn't feel the old fear. She didn't feel the need for his approval or his protection. She felt clean. She walked out of the server room and into the morning light of the main lobby. She didn't head for her office. She headed for the doors. She had one more thing to do, a public debt to pay, and a story to rewrite. The tech empire had done its job. It had found the truth. Now it was time for the billionaire to show the world what that truth was worth. The grand hall of Sterling Global was a sea of blinding camera flashes and low, expectant murmurs. Journalists from every major financial outlet and news network jostled for space, their microphones forming a thicket at the base of the podium. The air was electric with a singular assumption. Victoria Sterling was about to announce the massive Holloway merger, a move that would solidify her empire's dominance for the next decade. Behind the scenes, the board members adjusted their silk ties, smiling at the prospect of surging stock prices. They thought they were here to witness a coronation of capital. When Victoria finally emerged from the wings, the room went silent. She looked every bit the billionaire. Her suit was a sharp, midnight blue silk, her hair pulled back into a flawless, severe bun. But as she reached the podium, she didn't look at the teleprompter. She didn't look at the prepared financial statements. She looked directly into the lenses of the cameras, her eyes holding a clarity that unsettled the room. For years, Victoria began, her voice steady and resonant, this company has been defined by what it owns. We have measured our success in acquisitions, in assets, and in the strength of our walls. My father taught me that in our world, love is a luxury we cannot afford. I believed him. I built my life into a fortress of glass and gold, convinced that everyone I met was merely an opportunity or a threat. A confused ripple went through the crowd. This wasn't the language of a merger. Recently, she continued, her gaze softening, my walls were tested. I was shown the difference between value and worth. I was framed by someone I trusted, and I nearly destroyed the only honest man I have ever met because I was too blinded by my own cynicism to see the truth. At the back of the hall, Arthur Vane was absent, replaced by the heavy presence of the legal teams and investigators she had unleashed. Victoria paused, taking a deep breath. I am not here today to announce a merger. I am here to correct a grave injustice. Last week, a man named Marcus Reed was accused of theft within these walls. He was blacklisted and humiliated. Today, I am presenting the evidence that exonerates him completely and proves a conspiracy of corporate espionage led by my former COO. The room erupted. Shouts and questions collided in the air, but Victoria raised a hand, and the silence returned, heavier than before. But I am also here to make a personal announcement, she said, and for the first time, a genuine, radiant smile broke across her face. I spent my life looking for someone who didn't want a piece of the Sterling name. I found him in a man who saw me when I was invisible, a man who didn't care about my checkbook, but cared about my soul. She turned toward the side of the stage. Marcus, please. Marcus Reed stepped out from the shadows. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo or a designer suit. He wore a simple, well-pressed charcoal jacket and a white shirt, looking exactly like the man who had cooked bread in a dark kitchen. He walked with a quiet, unshakable dignity that no amount of money could buy. As he reached her side, the flashes became a continuous roar of light, but he didn't flinch. He looked only at Victoria. The board members gasped. The journalists scrambled to find out who he was. A waiter, someone whispered loudly. She's marrying a waiter. Victoria took Marcus' hand, her fingers interlacing with his in front of the world. To those who say this is a scandal, I say it is a homecoming. Marcus Reed is not a billionaire. He doesn't own towers or tech empires, but he owns himself. And in the world I've lived in, that makes him the wealthiest man I've ever known. Marcus stepped closer to the microphone. He didn't have a prepared speech. He looked at the crowd, then back at the woman beside him. I once told Victoria that the only things you truly own are the things you carry in your heart when the lights go out, he said, his voice calm and honest. I carry her, and that is more than enough for me. In a move that would be replayed on every screen across the globe for weeks, Marcus reached into his pocket and produced a small, simple silver band. It wasn't a diamond the size of a grape. It wasn't an heirloom with a bloody history. It was a plain circle of light. He didn't need to kneel. He simply looked her in the eyes and offered her a life of truth. Victoria didn't wait for him to ask. She took the ring and slipped it onto her finger, her hand trembling not with fear, but with joy. "Yes," she whispered, the word carrying through the silence of the stunned hall. The shocking announcement wasn't a business deal. It was the public dismantling of the wall Victoria Sterling had lived behind her entire life. As she pulled Marcus into a tight embrace, ignoring the chaos of the press, her father watched from the front row. The old man, who had spent a lifetime warning her about the smell of opportunity, slowly stood up and began to clap. He saw what the world was just beginning to realize. His daughter hadn't lost her empire. She had finally found something worth ruling for. The billionaire woman had fallen in love with a poor waiter, and what he did next, staying by her side when she had nothing but her name, had changed her forever. As they walked off the stage together, hand in hand, the cameras continued to flash, but Victoria didn't notice. She was finally looking at the jasmine, and for the first time, she wasn't alone in the garden. The richest love story in the city had only just begun, proving that while money can build a house, only the truth can make it a home. The story of Victoria Sterling and Marcus Reed serves as a powerful modern fable about the walls we build to protect ourselves and the courage it takes to tear them down. By mirroring the narrative arc of high-stakes betrayal, isolated vulnerability, and ultimate public vindication, we've transformed a classic trope into a cinematic journey of emotional stakes. Victoria's transformation from a guarded billionaire who viewed love as a luxury to a woman who defines her own worth through human connection completes a full emotional circle. Meanwhile, Marcus remains the steadfast anchor, the invisible man, whose quiet dignity eventually becomes the loudest voice in the room.